All right, so last week, unfortunately, I couldn't make it happen. So let's change this from 22 to, I guess, 29.
Yeah.
All right, and this is what I wanted to show last week. So now I have a little bit more to show. That's Elsa Studio updates. We have MongoDB provider support. Let's take a quick look at the commit history. So mostly my pushes have been about the .NET API client, which is used by the Blazor Studio application. Since that's also a .NET application, it makes sense that it uses the .NET client library for the REST API backend. So that's mostly these things. And Gurkhan has been fixing some issues of the roadmap for RC2, which looks like this. So he's been pushing quite a few of these items. I think this one is fixed. We just need to close this one. And I think this one is fixed as well, but he'll close these once he's sure it's fixed. And then these are to do, and this one. So basically, as soon as these items are processed, well, we should be able to do an RC2 release to NuGet.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll wait for any feedback, any major issues. And if there's no major issues, then then we could consider releasing 3.0. So maybe end of July, maybe sometime in August. And with luck, we could also release the Blazor implementation if it goes well, because then if once that's on par in terms of functionality with the stencil implementation, then why not? Yeah, so MongoDB, let me just show you quickly. Did you have any topics, by the way, that you wanted to discuss?
No, not for the topic.
Then the floor is all mine. A new module called Elsa MongoDB, and it basically implements all of the abstractions of, for example, the workflow definition store. So that's iWorkflow definition store, workflow instance store, etc. We look at MongoDB. So here we have a Elsa database or Elsa database with a bunch of collections that were created. So that just works. Oh, this one is empty. And this is a stale view, but it's nothing too exciting to show off. It's just just another implementation.
Yep.
If you want to see how it works or how to install it, there's a example project called MongoDB persistence.
Mm-hmm.
And all you should have to do is just reference Elsa MongoDB, the package or the project if you use the source code. And then for the various features that you are using in your application, you just use, this is required, use MongoDB. This will install some core services that are necessary, including the connection string. And then for each module, you can, if you want to use MongoDB, you just do use MongoDB for management, runtime. For the default runtime, which internally uses data persistence, if you want it to use MongoDB, that's possible as well. Mm-hmm. Execution log records, identity. So yeah, so that is cool that we have that. All right, let's switch to progress on Elsa Studio, which is basically the only thing I'm working on right now. I'm working as much on this thing as much as I can, because it will offer a lot more functionality compared to the stencil implementation. And actually, I want to move to a state where we can look at allow users to rehost the Blazor components in their own application, whether that's HTML or React or Vue or Angular. That would be good to have a single code base that we can continue to evolve while also allowing others to reuse it. And right now, of course, as you know, we have Stencil that you've been creating wrappers for Angular and React. But it having to maintain two versions of the designer is just gonna it's not ideal.
Yeah.
So let me just show you. So mainly what I've been working on is the designer itself, so that it becomes functional. And I think the last time I showed it was able to show activities also from the picker, but some work has been done in terms of, well, icon support. So before it was just hard-coded to the pencil icon. Now it's controlled by the activity itself.
Okay.
Some variations in colors. So I think Mohammed came with the idea to maybe use a color code for within a given group or a category. So now each category has its own color, which is configurable. If users don't like certain colors or want to use different colors, they can configure it easily.
Okay.
The way that works, there is a contract called Activity Display Settings Provider. And if you implement this one, so this is also, and this is what is so cool about using Blazor. If you want to customize or add functionality to the studio, or in this case, you want to create a custom activity and provide custom icons and colors and whatever we offer, all you would have to do is implement some interface registered with your DI system, and that's it. So no messing around with stencil and JavaScript, just easy peasy interface implementations. So there's currently just one default implementation that configures, the ones that are provided out of the box. So for the if, it uses some default activity colors, and this branching name, it's just the name of the category, which has the value of some color. So I just show some random colors, but you can easily change this. And because to make it even easier, so instead of having to suppress this default implementation or provide your own implementation that has higher priority than this one, I think this it doesn't have a priority yet, but that will be added so that you can actually override existing colors if you wanted to, but you could also choose to just change these static values. So it's very, very easy to change if you want to customize it. So that's been worked on. Search doesn't work yet. Another thing that has been worked on is the property editors. So last time you weren't able to do anything here. It was just displaying a hard-coded form, but now it actually works. So you can look at the various inputs. Well, this one doesn't have any inputs. This one has its own input. Flow switch has has a custom UI, which is another great benefit of using Blazor. If you are creating custom activities or you want to create a custom input editor for existing activities, now it's really easy. It will be because of the Blazor component model. I'll show you how this one works. So let's say you wanted to create a custom activity with some custom UI like this. What you would do is implement, not this one, but you need to implement a UI hint handler. So just to refresh, well, maybe not your memory, but whomever is watching, if you look at any given activity, let's say, well, let's look at the flow switch activity. So here I have the flow switch activity, and it has an input called cases. So these are the possible cases you can configure. So these are complex objects. So that's why we need a bit of a complex UI. And the way to do it, because this is an activity that it doesn't have any association with UI. It's just backend code, except for this little touch point, if you will. So it's a UI hint called flow switch editor. So this could be a custom value that you conjure up, and the way to connect it in the front end is by implementing a UI hint handler. So if we go to to switch back to the Blazor project, there should be a project called UI hint handlers, and you could do this in your own application or create your own class library. That doesn't matter, because the way it works is you implement this contract. So IUI hint handler, which exists in Elsa Studio Core. So this is like a shared library that you reference. Then you can implement IUI hint handler. and you just implement 3 members. Yes, just 3 members. So get supports UI hint returns, or it contains logic to return true if your handler supports a given UI hint. So in this case, we have the switch editor handler. So it's supporting these 2 UI hints. And if your handler returns true, then at some point the display input editor method will be called, and it expects you to return a random fragment, which is a Blazor object. So it's used by Blazor to actually render something. And to keep it simple, because creating complicated components using C# syntax like this, that's a little bit too could be rather complicated. But of course, the easiest thing to do is just to simply open a separate component. So I created a component called cases using Razor syntax. So here we have cases. So that's this component here. And this can be a very, however complicated you want it to be. You just implement it like this. And because it's Blazor, it's quite easy to implement fancy components like that. And of course, I'm using mud table.
And why do you need another in the handler when you open the component? Why do you need the attribute, the add attribute, line 18?
Okay, so when you implement a UI hint component, you will receive contextual information about the input being edited. So this is not required, but if you don't pass in any contextual information, then your component will be unable to update the selected activity, for example. So here we selected the flow switch. So it's probably useful to have a to know which activity we are editing, because it's not decoupled in that sense. So it's not like that it's not that the Studio framework will take all of this input and then copy it as input into your component. It just directly allows you to reference the activity being edited. So if we take a look at the editor context,
it's the parameter. Yes. Yes. Okay.
Oh yeah, exactly. So if we look at the cases component, you just expose it like this. So you could also rename this. This could be whatever you want. If you don't want to put it in like this, you don't have to. And yeah, but indeed, these are parameters on the components.
Okay.
And the display input context edit, just to give you a glimpse. So it, as I mentioned, it provides access to the activity being edited. It's descriptor, which could be useful for accessing metadata about the activity, like what is its category, its inputs, its outputs, etc. Yeah. So in this case, we're looking at the flow switch, which has this UI hint handler. And this works as well. So this is also what I've been working on, implementing the various UI hint handlers. I'm not sure if I managed to implement them all. Probably there's 1 or 2 that aren't implemented yet, but majority of them have been implemented. And here I'm using the mud Blazor table and its inline editing feature. So it works a little bit different from the stencil implementation, which where I created it from scratch. Here I'm reusing mud Blazor components, so which made it very easy to do. So you can choose the syntax for a given expression. So these are the conditions for a given case that should match in order for this outcome to be returned. So this could be something like this, and then you click the checkbox, and then it's there. That didn't look good. So for some reason, when I demo something, that's when I discover issues. I don't know why. And now it's here. So I don't know what I did, but I did so. I will do some more tests. Yeah, so that's the flow switch and its input. There's of course the drop downs. One thing I wanted to show also is the HTTP endpoint, or the requests. Oh, there you go. So here I forgot to implement the HTTP status codes UI. That will have to be implemented as well.
Yes, but the warning is really cool.
Yes, yeah, I agree. It's helpful instead of the thing blowing up in your face or suddenly becoming ugly. At least this is it's a friendly reminder. Oh,
Yes.
okay, we missed something. Let's see, authorize policy.
And can we customize the UI of the shape on the designer?
You mean these things?
Yes.
Yes, I haven't done an example yet, but it should be quite easy to do because if we look at the current implementation, it works like this. So if we go to the workflow designer, so this project is what glues Blazor stuff with the X6 JavaScript graph editing library, which works like this. So here we have the client lib and some source. And basically, of course, it uses JS interrupt. So I have an interrupt folder here with designer JS interrupt and just some C# functionality that then calls into, you know, the JS object reference, the module, so to speak, and then calling into these things. But what is being rendered here? These things are actual Blazor components wrapped inside of a custom element. So this is all X6. X6 renders this custom element, which renders a Blazor component.
Okay.
And this Blazor component lives here. So there's an activity wrapper. And as I mentioned, right now, I don't have any examples where I replace it, but I'm going to make a small update so that you can customize what is rendered. And I'm not yet sure if I will keep the activity wrapper and then have this wrapper component maybe call out to some custom handler similar to the UI hint handler, but maybe, you know, a activity designer handler, so to speak, that you then get to implement. And if you match a certain activity type, for example, or maybe based on some other conditions based on the activity descriptor that you're receiving in your handler, you can just provide your own component. So you can imagine that instead of rendering this, we will just render so this will be an object from the code behind. So you would say custom component. So and this would be a field, as I mentioned, from the code behind as a result from invoking these handlers that matches. So very easy to make it extensible like this. And if there's no handlers, then it will just render the default layout. So it's going to be so easy to customize this.
Do you plan to display the description on this?
I hadn't thought about it, but do you think we should?
I don't know. I'm just thinking about this because I think we have to describe a lot of activity, and then maybe it could be useful to have a button that display all description or collapse description, and this allow you to follow all your flow with the description and know everything the developer want to
like documentation of your flow. Yeah, that's not a bad idea. So similar to here in the comments section, there will be the display name, where we could also add a description. So you can add a more lengthy text if you want, and maybe an option to display it on the flowcharts. Sure. Like and here.
If we have any place to describe activity, workflow, etc., it could be easier than to create some other tools that extract and create automatic documentation.
Very nice. Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. Do you think, just going back to the description of an activity, do you think it should automatically display the description somewhere, or should we maybe have like a little post-it, like an activity that you can drag and drop and then enter it, or should it be associated with the activity and then the designer should figure out where to display it?
I think the designer should display it just maybe under the flow switch, and be able to toggle display and hide on maybe all the activity to be able to have a big picture of our workflow and the different description.
Yeah, maybe exactly. And maybe there could be a toggle here. So
Yeah.
this is an autosave toggle, which by the way is implemented as well. So if you don't enable this, then no changes will be saved until you press the save button. But if you toggle it on, then it will just save always. And initially, whenever it saved the changes automatically, it would show a little progress bar, but it became very annoying for me, so I removed it. But it would be good to have some other visual UI hint that so that you can feel comfortable that it actually successfully saved your changes. Maybe there should be some little bulb, like a little green circle, which means it's not dirty anymore. But when you make a change, it becomes orange, which means dirty. And then it switches to green once it's saved. For example, I'm still thinking that.
Or the icon on the floppy, icon, you can add a
little check mark.
Yeah, how would you call this in Blazor? I just like the word, like in the notification icon. Yes, and
maybe a spinner when it's saving.
Yeah.
So notice it's very, very quick. But if you notice, if I click, there will be briefly there will be a little progress bar. You see when I click?
It's so like a badge in the Blazor. You know, the badge in overlay in the notification icon, for example, and we can have a green tick when it's okay on the floppy, and when it's not already saved, maybe another color.
I like that. So like this security issues here, my screen here, it shows a little, well, just a little lock icon, but this could be a green tick if on the floppy disk icon. Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, I will implement something like that. So there's a little visual bug when I collapse the bottom panel. It's completely hidden, but it doesn't always happen. So I don't know when it does. So when it does happen, you need to. Oh, that's a buggy workflow that I was currently working on. Let me restart the server. Yeah, it's because this workflow one. I was experimenting with creating a new workflow. So one of the complaints I often hear is that when you create a new workflow, it doesn't generate a proper default name. So if you don't create specify names, then all of your workflows will be called workflow 1 or something like that. Plus, and I think this was the case in Elsa 1, where the name would be empty always. So every workflow would be called default workflow or something like that, or unnamed. So here I'm thinking maybe it's better to just, whenever you create a workflow, you are prompted to give a name, and it will automatically generate a unique name. So it knows that this is a unique name. It has built-in validation. I'll show you that as well. So let's say we try to do workflow 1. We try to create it. It will not work. So it uses Fluent validation, and it makes an API call to validate the name. So, but when I do create this workflow, it crashes because of a bug that I introduced. Hey,
but the name is not a key. It just have to be unique, but it's not a key.
It's not a key. So if you don't use a unique name, then it's not going to cause any issues either. Not yet, anyways. Maybe in a future release, maybe we'll have some functionality where you want to uniquely identify workflows, and then maybe it could be problematic if you have workflows with the same name.
Mm-hmm.
But even if not, the name is considered part of the identity of a workflow, so you should be able to uniquely identify workflows even by name.
Okay.
But technically, it's not a problem if you have the same name for multiple workflows. Okay. Yeah, these things I have yet to implement. The delete buttons, pagination, that works automatically thanks to Blazor. So this is the only one that currently works. I also want to do things like cron expression editors. Maybe there's a Blazor component out there that allows you to do it. At the very least, we'll have a time picker and a date, a calendar picker, right? So that's going to be better than having to type in some date manually.
Yeah.
Oh, and of course I shouldn't forget to show the Monaco editor. So that's implemented as well. So it has liquid. Default just means the default UI, and if you want to switch, then that just works as well.
Great.
Well, maybe not so great. It just lost my information. What happened there?
And you use the Blazor Monaco library?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
This is a new bug. I'll look into that. So so that's Monaco. So once I fix this issue and once I've implemented creation of new workflows, then the next step will be implementing embedded activities. So what I mean by that is, let's say we have the if activity. Oh, this is okay. So this is not a flow if. The flow flow decision will display true false, but this one should display then and else, not as these flow ports, but as embedded sockets like what we have in the stencil designer. Let me open it for a second. So while that loads, if you remember, there will be then and else will be displayed as nested elements in this component, right? And it has to do also with these breadcrumbs. So you should be able to add activities to the embedded ports. That's what they are called, and that is useful for for the if activity, but also for, I think, email. Email has an error outcome, or not an outcome, but an error activity, that or error property of type activity that you can configure to execute some logic when sending email fails, for example. And so we have many of these. So we also have branching, looping. So for example, the for each has a body embedded port. So those things that's next on my list to implement. And of course, still the somewhat low-hanging fruit like workflow properties, variables is a little bit more work. Maybe settings, input output that we already have in Stencil, so we also need that in Blazor. And once those items have been done, then I think for the most part it's very on par in terms of functionality with the Stencil implementation. So then it could actually be used by users, and then we can move forward by focusing on seeing how we can make it reusable, rehostable. And once we figure that one out, then we can continue with things like secrets, webhooks, user management, role management, and then any more modules can enter the ecosystem.
Yeah.
So this is what I was talking about, these little sockets. If you click on this one, then you see the breadcrumbs and you can configure it.
Okay.
So actually, I think that's
I'm just
all
thinking,
I have to show.
in something when, for example, imagine you have you want to send 2 emails and you have the same error body for the 2 email. How can you use the same body error and not redefine the same thing for the 2 activities?
So with this one, you wouldn't. Well, it would still be possible if you wanted. If you would, for example, implement it in a separate workflow, and then you could call that workflow. And this workflow could be reusable as an activity, as a composite activity. So that would be one way, but it wouldn't be ideal, I think.
Yeah.
So maybe for those cases, what you really want is not this setup here, but send email like here. So maybe there should be a done or an okay outcome or done and an error. And then you could have 2 of those send emails and they would both go to the same logic.
Same error. Yes.
Yeah, that's a good observation that you made. Maybe I should revise this and make it a flow outcome and not an embedded. Or maybe we should have a flow email and normal email. Similar to having a flow decision, which is functionally the same as this if, but the key difference, of course, being that this one has embedded stuff, which is nice when you do have isolated functionality that you don't want to reuse. But there's also flow decision, which has a different style. Ultimately, I think what we want, so this is more of a hybrid flowchart, if you will, right? So it's a hybrid between flowchart and sequential diagrams. So in Windows Workflow Foundation 4, there's a strict separation between sequential diagrams and flowcharts and state machines. And maybe that will evolve also into that strict separation while maintaining this hybrid approach for if you want to. But yeah, it's remains to be seen. One requirement for that to work, of course, is that we have different designers. And I did start working on enabling this. So, for example, let's say we have a workflow that doesn't start with a flowchart, but with a sequence activity. So let's say we can't use the designer for that, so we'll use the API to create a new workflow definition with a sequence activity as its root. So yeah, so for example, this one, this well, it's not a sequence, but it's even maybe an even better example. So also to show the flexibility of the engine. So here I'm gonna create a new workflow definition called Hello World. And its root, instead of it being a flowchart, it's going to be a very simple write line. So I'll click send. So now we should be able to see it here. Yeah, it doesn't refresh when you just click this thing here. So I think, yeah. Okay, so here there's the hello world. Oh, I broke that as well, unfortunately. So what you should have seen is the designer, but just with that activity, and you wouldn't be able to move it around. And it's like more of a fallback designer, but because now we have the system in place where you have, similar to the UI hint handlers and the activity display handlers, there's now a diagram designer provider that you can implement, which can provide the designer component for a given activity type. And if there's no such designer, then there's this fallback diagram editor that's now failing to load. For flowchart, obviously it's using the flowchart designer. And so this way we can also implement a sequence diagram editor and a state machine diagram editor and a BPMN diagram editor. So it's very, very pluggable in this way.
Okay.
Yeah, and once we have those different designers, then possibly what we'll have is people start to use the flowchart editor just for flow activities, and each flow activity itself could, of course, embed a sequence diagram and a state machine diagram, etc. And maybe people prefer the mixed mode that we have right now because it is very, very flexible. But my only issue with it is that you now have flow variants and sequential variants for basically, well, for potentially many of them. For example, send email will have 2 versions, so that's the only downside, I think. I did experiment with a way to maybe change the look of a given activity without having to have 2 versions. So basically, by having the send email having an error property of type iActivity, for example, but then depending on your designer settings, it would either display as an outcome like this or as an embedded port. But I forgot the details, but it became too complicated to. At some point, I was writing logic to follow the paths basically, and then trying to wrap it in a flow chart. Because if you have a single child, like for example, let's remove this one. Let's say there's just this if. So in this case, what I wanted then is to store the if activity directly in the error property of the send email. But as soon as you start to add more, then basically this entire stuff would have to be stored in the error activity. But that logic to determine what belongs to this thing and then having to artificially wrap it in a flowchart, or maybe potentially a sequence if it's more of a sequential flow like this. This is more of a sequential. So I gave up on this idea. It was too complicated.
Understand.
Yeah. So now it's just the simplicity now lies in it's either having these flow ports or embedded ports, and that's it. And at the end of the day, you can configure the system any way you want. And a good improvement would be to have the option to configure a diagram editor. Like, for example, this is the flowchart flowchart diagram designer is what it's called. To have it to configure it with the activities that it allows you to add and to be able to pick from the left-hand side. So maybe you as an application or a workflow application implementer, you decide to only show flow activities for flowchart diagram editors and sequential activities for sequence editors, for example. And then this way you have basically potentially the same system as you have in Windows Workflow Foundation.
Have you already created a CI to publish preview nugget?
No, not yet. No. Do you want to have these nuggets?
Yes, to start integrate the different parts on my UI and maybe see what is missing or how we have to create the different package. Maybe we need some separation or some merge of some package to be able to give something quickly usable for the developer.
Makes sense. I'll set up a preview feed for the studio packages, and then you can start playing around with those.
Those and maybe I can also playing on the different wrapper for the.
Yeah, that would be so cool. Yeah. And I think we spoke about this last time. We want to be able to reuse individual components. So this one should be optional. This one should be optional. We should be able to use the Lego block approach, including the settings, right? So maybe you also want to just take this thing and program it manually. So there should be an API exposed so that you can assign it. Well, actually, that's already the case. You can assign this thing a workflow definition, and it will display the workflow.
That's good. That there is a lot of UI improvement. That's really good. Really good work.
Thank you. Yeah, inching forward. Yeah, and as I mentioned, I summarized the work remaining to be done before it could potentially replace this stuff here. Cool. All right, then in that case, thank you for attending, and I'll probably see you next week.
Yeah. Sure. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Have a
Bye-bye.
good one. Bye-bye.